Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest edition. I always say that. I think every time I listen to the recordings of this thing, I say the same thing at the start. And I keep thinking this is really like Groundhog Day, which, of course, as you know, is an area of interest that I have in the first place. We are back into repetition. But today we are back into repetition because we have a returning guest, somebody whose work I've admired for many, many years. Is a gentleman called Jim Elvidge. And Jim was on this show, I think, around about 18 months ago, when we were discussing his previous work. But he's now got a brand new book out with the name of Digital Consciousness. And I have to say that I've read most books on digital consciousness because, as you guys know, I write about this myself. I would say that if you had one book to read on this subject, that you wanted a perfect, rational, sensible, science-based analysis of the simulation argument, this is the best book to get, bar none. I know a lot of you out there like Tom Campbell. I know a lot of you out there like an awful lot of other writers, but this really puts it so succinctly, rather similar to Jim's previous book, The Universe Explained, but this one takes it a lot further. And it does it in a very, very radical way. And he comes up with some fantastic ideas. I mean, we will touch upon his concept of the clowns later, hopefully, because I think that is absolutely wonderful. But we will touch upon that later. Right, a little bit about background for Jim, if you've not come across Jim's work, and if you haven't, you need to. Jim holds a master's degree in electrical engineering from Cornell University. He's applied his training into the high-tech world as a leader in technology and enterprise management, including many years in executive roles for various companies and entrepreneurial ventures. He holds 4 patents in digital signal processing. Beyond the high-tech realm, however, Elvidge has years of experience as a musician, writer, and truth seeker. He merged his technology skills with his love of music and developed one of the first PC-based digital music samplers and co-founded Radio AMP, the first private label online streaming radio company. And for many years, Jim has kept pace with the latest research theories and discoveries in the various fields of subatomic physics, cosmology, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and the paranormal. This unique knowledge has provided the foundation for his first full-length book, The Universe Solved. And as I said, in his latest book, Digital Consciousness, he takes it to a whole new level. And, you know, while I was reading this book, I kept thinking all the time, you know, that we cover so many similar areas. But Jim has the ability that sometimes I fail to do, which is to actually get something that's really complex down to a very straightforward explanation. I mean, some of the things that I'll touch upon in the interview, I'm hoping, is the work on the GEO 6000 device in Germany, and also the work of people like Juan Maldacana and the people who are arguing about the way in which digital information and black holes and the way there's a direct relationship between the Planck squared lengths on black holes and the way the universe functions as well. So Jim, without further ado, I am delighted and honored as always to have you on the show. And if nothing else, it's great to be interviewing somebody who has actually been in a photograph with one of my favorite female actresses, which I keep going on about, the girl that was in Lost. I still love that photograph, Jim. You know.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you, Anthony. I have to say, I think you and I have a certain resonance here. You know, we talk about the same things, we think about the same things, we learn from each other. I've read your material, listened to your podcasts over the years, and I also, you know, have to take a moment to just commend you for doing this show. Like, a lot of authors are all about their material, and that's all they want to talk about. But you've gone the extra mile, and it shows a passion for learning, that you have an hourly show once a month where you bring in people who have maybe different points of view or maybe supplemental points of view, and you bring that to your fans and your listeners and everything. And I think it's a really cool and unusual thing that you do. I think it's awesome.
Well, thank you, Jim. I'm honored. To me, the whole situation here is that I hate silo thinking, and I agree with you. I come across it an awful lot where there are fellow writers who just want to keep their little bit to themselves and they don't share it. And by not doing that, we're missing such a trick, because it's like one of your examples in your book, and I think it sums it up, when you use the example of the Venn diagrams, and when you use the examples of how certain work overlaps in certain ways, and you draw a Venn diagram, the area of overlap is where the solution lies. And I think people like you're coming from a subtly different angle to me. I'm coming from an angle very much kind of from the psychological, from the neurophysiological and the neurochemical. we move together. And if we work together, we can really do something about this. Because you and I both suffer. I was interesting to discover that you and I both suffered from censorship at Wikipedia, and the way in which we're not allowed. I was taken off Wikipedia unilaterally, and I think you were as well, weren't you? I think.
Yeah, I had a kind of a friend and fan of my work who put a page up, and when they reviewed the page, they determined that there just wasn't enough significance. And to me, it was a little bit of censorship. Like, here's somebody who actually has a good reason for putting a page up, and there are people like I don't even want to name the names, but the most low-class reality TV stars have Wikipedia pages, and here people like you and I who have done some research into solutions to quantum mechanics that nobody else has thought about, or some ideas on consciousness or what life is all about, don't get a Wikipedia page. All right, fine, is what it is. I just kind of accepted that, but it just kind of shows the bias that exists out there. There's still this materialism bias, despite all the physical sciences evidence to the contrary.
I totally agree. And the thing is, I was similar in the sense that I didn't know who'd put the Wikipedia page up. I'd not put it up, and it just appeared one day. And, it got a lot of hits and people were very, very interested. And one day, in exactly the same circumstances as you find yourself in, somebody from Wikipedia just decided that it was just not acceptable, Now, again, from my point, I've sold around 100,000 books worldwide. My books are into every major European language and many minor ones. And I'm not considered to be anything. And what I have to say is irrelevant. And here's you've got a master's degree in electrical engineering, for God's sake, from Cornell. You're a scientist, you're a mathematician, you know what you're talking about here, but your credibility is hacked. And it moves in quite quickly into one of the questions I was going to ask later, but your concept of clowns. Can we just touch upon that a second? Because I think that was just so important. Clowns, just for everybody else, is the church of logical objectivism and willful but nonsensical skepticism. I love that. Can you tell us a little bit about this, please? Because it's a real fantastic riposte back at the critic.
Yeah, it came from just the observation that, obviously there are a lot of people out there who are going to put forth any kind of nonsense or whatever about some of these topics. So you have to look at everything with a skeptical point of view. However, an awful lot of scientists do take, and people who follow science, and believe in science, take an extreme skeptical point of view where they're basically closed-minded to new ideas. And that isn't science. Science is being open-minded to new ideas, looking at evidence, considering it, even if it defies what you already believe in. What is belief? Belief is, that's just your mind, thinking one thing, and everybody has different beliefs. So believing in something is not a reason to not accept different kinds of evidence. So, I talk about that in the book, and many cases where people who did some advanced research, some groundbreaking blue sky, out of the box thinking, were shunned. Some even passed away without ever having been vindicated. And then there are others that were vindicated before they passed away. Over the years, it's been happening for a couple hundred years, and it just led to this mentality. There's a more extreme mentality that Anthony and I have both come across, where people will start calling names, pseudoscience, crackpot, things like that. And it's really unnecessary. But there's a cult around it, and there are people who are sort of leaders of this cult. And when you start looking at the way they blindly believe in certain things and they revere some of these leaders, it feels like a church. It feels like a dogmatic religion. And I'm a spiritual person. I believe in a lot of things that would normally be considered spiritual, but I'm not somebody who's a believer in a particular dogma of a religion, because I think that's created by man, and it's not the underlying truth. And however, there is this sort of religion of science that scientism, I think some people have called it. So I just came up with this acronym that kind of describes these people as clowns. and I go off on a soapbox a little bit for a couple of pages in the book. But it's my book. I'm free to do that, and it's worth bringing the idea to people, because they're going to come across them when you go on physics forums and things like that. Even people who just like genuinely have interesting ideas, they'll just get disparaged if they're not up to the level of some of the listeners and contributors to those forums.
I think it was very, very sad that over here in the UK, we had a few years ago an opportunity to have a stamp done for all of the living, I think it was living Nobel Prize winners in the UK. And one of the people that was put forward wasn't put forward. They were going to do the stamp, is Professor Brian Josephson. Now, Brian Josephson, as you probably know, is
Josephson Junction, right?
No, pardon?
Is that Josephson Junction transistors?
That's it, the Josephson Junction guy. Now, I've met Brian a couple of times at events. We're both members of the Scientific and Medical Network. And there was a real furore about the idea that this guy could be allowed to be on a stamp as a physicist, and because he's interested in telepathy, because he's interested in looking at the areas we look at. And literally, I think I'm correct in saying the stamp never came out. And I thought that was absolutely outrageous. You had people with zero qualifications in physics dissing and destroying the reputation of a Nobel Prize winner just because he was thinking outside of the box. It is absolutely outrageous. It really is. But
it is, especially when you consider some of the things that are considered acceptable research in science, like string theory. String theory doesn't have a shred of evidence. It's not testable. It's not falsifiable yet. The many worlds theory, the many worlds hypothesis of quantum mechanics, it's not testable. It's not falsifiable. It's not observable. It's not predictable. And yet, scientists are free to believe in that and espouse those ideas. So it's very odd how certain things are acceptable areas of research and certain things aren't, and those boxes just stay very fixed for a long time.
Well, it is. It's like, I mean, we'll get started in a second, but I just love where this argument discussion is going. But like, for instance, the thing that really annoys me is the way in which an awful lot of modern physics and quantum mechanics is actually sort of the tail wagging the dog. What we do is we don't use observation as such. We use observation and have anomalous circumstances that we can't explain, and then come up with a bizarre explanation as to how it can be. Like the idea of hyperinflation in the first trillionth of a millisecond at the start of the Big Bang.
Yep.
I mean, it's a classic, isn't it? And the idea, this is the only because the maths doesn't work at that point. So we create some completely spurious belief system, which if we came up with it and said, this is what has happened, and everything came from a point and expanded outwards at a huge millions of times the speed of light, they'd go, you're crazy, you're mad, But anyway, this is on my soapbox, but let's get back to you and back to your book. So in your previous book, The Universe Solved, I've read it and have enjoyed it, but what are the differences? What have you developed new in digital consciousness? Where have you moved it on to?
Sure, yeah, good question. So the previous book was basically an introductory exploration into some of these ideas. And it explored a few categories of evidence that our reality is virtual and programmatic in some way. Digital consciousness has taken the previous 10 years from when I wrote the first book was 2008, I believe. 10 years since then, all kinds of new ideas, research has come about, and I wanted to kind of bring readers up to date on that. So it explores dozens of categories of evidence that our reality is actually digital and virtual, and that consciousness is more fundamental than matter. Also explores some correlation between the historical human and spiritual experience and its affinity or its connection with this digital consciousness theory. The Universe Solved, the first book, was a little bit agnostic about why and how our reality came about. Digital consciousness is probing a little bit deeper and saying, here's a strong hypothesis for the why and the how. I think the biggest advantage, though, or the biggest gain, is the scientific framework. So I use a technique called Abductive Logic, which is a valid scientific method that makes a very strong case for digital consciousness theory, very similar to Tom Campbell's my big toe, as you had mentioned before. There are plenty of other people who have had similar ideas. And I should mention, I think it was Albert Einstein said, there's 5 new ideas every century, something like that. And we all kind of stand on the shoulders of giants and connect dots and use a lot of different ideas. So I'm certainly not going to claim that what's in the book is, purely mine or anything like that. I try to give credit everywhere where credit is due. But the scientific framework shows a very strong case for this theory being a true theory of everything. In addition, I use a visual model that I think makes it a little bit easier to understand. A lot of people learn things visually. It's very difficult to visualize things or get concepts through a bunch of words. Sometimes it's easier to see a diagram or a model of something or get an analogy of it. I try to bring those kinds of things into the book so that this makes a little bit more sense. And finally, there's a connection to sort of other philosophies. You hear things like the holographic theory. Is that a counter theory to this, or is it correlated to this in some way? Cellular automata, string theory, all these things, do they fit in some way? And I actually believe that a lot of them do, and I show a way that it can all be kind of, you can make sense out of a lot of these kinds of things, including spirituality within the nature of this theory.
Well, can we dig into a little bit of the science? Because one of the things, as I said earlier, I think that you do superbly well is getting across a lot of the developing evidence, the work of Craig Hogan and various other individuals, say Waldman Dekana, Jacob Bekenstein, these guys that were doing some very, very interesting work in terms of how there is strong evidence that the universe is digital. So if you can spend as long as you like just explaining how you pull this together in your arguments in the book, without obviously giving too much of the book away. Sure. But just to give the listeners an idea, or the watchers, whoever they are, whoever you're out there, guys, as to what you mean and how you develop the science of this.
Sure. In terms of, there's 2 key aspects to think about here. One is the idea that our reality, our apparent physical reality here, what we think of as this physical reality, that deep down it's digital, it's based on information, and there's really pretty much nothing there. And I mean nothing in terms of stuff. When you knock on a wall or a door or something like that, you feel something. Well, when you dream, you feel things too. But we all believe that our dreams are, not fantasies, but perhaps something that is conjured up by our minds. So we discount that. But it's no different in this reality. We are experiencing all of the senses in this reality. The only difference is that it's a consensus kind of experience. So I'm saying that deep down, everything is composed of information, and it's all digital. And then the second idea is that consciousness is fundamental, and that consciousness is actually not an emergent property of our brains. It's something separate. And when you put those 2 together and think about the logical conclusion, you realize that we're in this essentially a virtual reality. So on the digital evidence side, a lot of people have commented on, well, that sounds very cold and calculating. You mean I'm living in a laptop, or I'm living, in a computer system somewhere? No, that's just what we think of when we talk about the word digital or programs or simulations. We think of these things that run, on our laptops. Whether or not something is digital or continuous it's almost philosophical. And an analogy that I use a lot of times is the idea of, say, dropping a stone in the water. If you drop a stone in the water, you see a number of waves coming out, rippling out in a circle from the point of entry of the stone. You can count the number of waves. That makes those waves a discrete element. And yet those waves are composed of water, which we think of as continuous, until you realize that water is composed of molecules, which are discrete elements, until you realize that those molecules and the atoms are composed of fields, according to science, which are continuous, until you realize that those fields, come from, quantum physics, which at its core is a quantum is a discrete concept. There's a finite limit to space and time. And so as far as deep down as we can observe, we can't really tell whether things are digital or continuous. They just look continuous. It feels like our, the time, and I know, Anthony, you've done a lot of thinking and research on the nature of time, but it feels like time is a continuous thing, and there's always some time in between any point, 2 points in time that you can point to, and there's always some space between any 2 points in space, no matter how small they get, that you can point to. And the question is that true? And it's not an obvious question, but there is actually there is zero evidence that our world is continuous, both in terms of space and time. And yet there's a lot of evidence that it's discrete. Some of the evidence are things like the idea that physics will break down if there's an infinite resolution. The idea of a continuous reality means you have to have infinite resolution. So if I'm going to say, this object exists in this space right here, if it's continuous, to put a dimension on it, I would have to go to an infinite resolution to identify that point. Well, if we had an infinite resolution in physics, we would have all kinds of breakdowns of the equations of physics. Infinities are prohibited in physics. And for one specific experimental example, Hawking radiation has never been observed above a certain level. The frequency is inversely related to the wavelength. A wavelength of something is going to be related to its structure. And nobody's ever observed Hawking radiation above the reciprocal of the Planck length, and the Planck length is the limit in quantum mechanics. So that tells you that there's something fundamental there that we can't get above, and there is probably no deeper reality than the Planck length. There could be, but we're not observing anything, in terms of that Hawking radiation. Same with, neutrino energies. We see an upper bound on neutrino energies, which wouldn't make sense if there was infinite resolution and a continuous reality. Theoretically, you could create a waveform that vibrates at an infinite frequency, but we don't see that. So some people have speculated that could be due to a reality lattice, which is exactly what I'm talking about. Some other examples, things that you would never experience in a continuous reality, like particles. Subatomic particles have a concept of a spin. And in a particle interaction, that spin number, which is always either an integer or it's a 1/2 spin, or some number like 1.5 or minus 1.5. Those numbers never change. They never go from say 1/2 to minus 1/2 and through all of the the numbers there. 0.4 is minus 0.4, minus 3.3, whatever. They go instantly from one spin number to another spin number. And that's indicative of actually logic, the kind of programmatic logic that I could program that on a computer. I could say, well, when these two particles come in contact, the next state is that this particle has this spin and this particle has that spin. There's nothing continuous that would explain how it can discretely go from one spin number to another, but a programmatic construct could explain that very, very well. So those are just a few things. We also see things like, very unusual examples of what I would call equations creating reality. So we usually use equations to describe reality. Maxwell came up with equations that best modeled the way electromagnetic radiation worked, the way magnetic fields begat electric fields, and so forth. And what we found, though, is that some of these equations, I don't know if you remember back in trigonometry, the idea of imaginary numbers. Imaginary numbers were all great. It made the math work out. You could come up with solutions to mathematical equations. But in real life, something that was a real attribute of things, if there was an imaginary number solution to it, you threw it out or you ignored it. Or if there was a negative number. Give an example. Let's say you're trying to solve the length of a fence. If you know that the fence is in the shape of a square, and the area that it's a circumference of is, say, 9 square meters. Well, what's the length of the fence? It's the square root of 9 square meters. And there are two solutions to that, 3 and -3. So the length of one side of the fence is either 3 or it's -3 meters. Well, it can't be -3 meters because there's no such thing as negative, a negative size or a negative length. So we throw that solution out. However, what we're finding is that those negative solutions that normally get thrown out have artifacts that come from those negative solutions that we observe in the physical world. It makes no sense unless the equations themselves are defining reality. So it's a very interesting kind of concept. James Gates is also observed in the string theory equations. I have to say those are man-made equations, so this is a little bit of an odd thing. But he observes what are known as error correction codes, which are the kind of codes that you generally put into a string of data to make sure that a bit doesn't flip due to electromagnetic field or something like that. If a bit flipped in data between one bank and another bank, you could get a transfer of money of $1 million instead of the $100 that you're trying to transfer. So these are really important in data communications, but you would never expect to see these kinds of things in reality unless reality was a programmatic construct. So Gates is even seeing, and he's a scientist who's found some examples of error correction codes in what some people consider the equations of reality. So there's a very quick, maybe 5-minute exploration into some of the categories that seem to show pretty clearly that the world is digital. Now, if you take any one of those things, people can always come up with an explanation for that thing. But then you take a second one of those, they'll have to come up with a different explanation because these are from very different fields and very different ideas. And those two explanations are now, now you're creating a very strange set of circumstances to explain a lot of, anomalies away. Whereas in one fell swoop, you can explain them all by saying, deep down, everything is just information. Then it all makes sense.
Wow. Because there were so many things. I've been madly making notes here because one of the things that's fascinated me for a long time in my research into both quantum physics and the history of quantum physics is the amount of times that somebody would think of a concept like the Planck length, with Max Planck, 1900, act of desperation. He plugs a random number in to make his equations work. And then suddenly this number starts to occur everywhere, and then you have, de Broglie, with his ideas. And I'm particularly thinking now the idea of quantum leaping. People use the term quantum leaping all the time, but most non-scientists or people who are not trained in science or read about science aren't aware of exactly what is taking place here. Is when an electron in an orbit, in raised commas, leaps from one orbit to another, but it doesn't cross the intervening space. It literally
Perfect. Yep.
And reappears in another one and gives off a photon of energy. And this photon that's taken out is what we see and what creates the reality around us. And then I thought the ultraviolet catastrophe itself, the whole thing that started quantum physics, was the idea of can you have an infinite number of waves inside a black box? Right. And of course it doesn't work. Now, your point there that you touched upon, but I'd like you to continue on because it's an area that really fascinates me, is the way in which they've now been doing the calculations of looking at the size of the area of a black hole and what happens to information when it's thrown in a black hole and the relationship it has with Planck squares. I'd be just really interested if you could just, because you explain that so well in the book.
Yeah, and to be honest, I'd probably have to reread parts of this to refresh myself on it. I mean, it's just so packed with information. But there are some interesting correlations between, say, Boltzmann's law and sort of information theory. So the nature of absorbing information in a black hole is related to the size of the black hole. Now, some people have created a theory that says we're living on a projection of the surface of a black hole. So they've taken scientific concepts, bona fide scientific concepts, and tried to make sense of these relationships between information theory and physical theory. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. To me, that feels like we're trying to force fit some observations into a theory. But it does make a lot of sense to me to talk about the kind of things that we're talking about, that information is ultimately everything that there is. So the black hole projection idea is not one that I'm really in favor of, but it is an interesting correlation that it matches information theory.
So what you do, and I remember listening to one of your interviews many years ago, which was what made me actually really interested in your first book, was the way you explain Nick Bostrom's idea of why it is almost a certitude that we are living in a simulation. And again, I think your explanation of Bostrom's theory was actually clearer than Bostrom himself in terms of how you put that together. So could you explain a little bit about how that works and the logic behind that, and Moore's law, and how that whole thing pans through?
Sure. And, it's interesting you bring that up, because you were just talking about de Broglie and others who had these insights that, led to, developments in science, and where did these things come from? And it feels very Carl Jung-ish, that there's sort of this collective consciousness going on that's evolving. And Bostrom was part of that. The movie The Matrix came out in 1999. Of course, Philip K. Dick, who I know you've written about, and I'm sure you know quite a bit more about his history than I do. But he coined the term programmed reality, I think, back in the 70s or the 80s. So, it wasn't Bostrom's idea necessarily, but these movies came out: Existence, 13th Floor, The Matrix, and then Bostrom comes out at the same time with a paper called the Simulation Argument, or something like that. Anyway, the way his idea goes, and this is just thinking it through from a logical perspective, is this: we are creating virtual reality environments. We're doing it through gaming systems. There was a little bit of an advancement in virtual reality back in the 90s, and then we realized that the technology wasn't there enough to make it real enough for people to really resonate with it. So now it's come back. We've got Oculus, we've got Sony's system and other systems that are really pretty amazing. But so that brings us up to today. The virtual reality systems, the state of the art is such that it's almost indistinguishable from reality, from what you see. And as you turn around, you're seeing, a different world. The sound is virtually indistinguishable from reality. So what's missing? Okay, we're not getting the olfactory sense. If you're in a jungle or something, you should be smelling things too. And what is also missing is the fact that you realize that you're in a simulation because you remember the time before you put your headset on. But researchers are also doing experiments with suppressing memories, injecting memories. They've put memories into mice or worms or some smaller animals and help them solve mazes, things like this. So the idea of memories being very flexible in terms of being suppressed or being injected into you is at its infancy, but it's growing also. So think about this from the standpoint of where we're going. We're going to get to a point where we can create simulations that are indistinguishable from reality. That you're going to be in one. Maybe you'll snort up some nanobots, or there will be a mind probe or something like that that suppresses your memories. Uploads your state of your recall, replaces it with the construct of the fantasy that you're playing out, and then when you're done with it, it reloads things back in. But during the time that you're experiencing this, you're completely unaware. And that's Bostrom's idea. He calls that a post-human time, when we hit the point where we can play out simulations that are indistinguishable from reality. Some people have put that 10 years out, 20 years out. It doesn't even matter. It could be 50 years out. If we're going to get there, then the conclusion you can draw is a couple of things. One, if we're going to get there, we're going to create millions of these simulations. We're going to figure out what it was like to be back in the time of the pyramids. We're going to, experience the JFK assassination. We're going to figure out what it was like to live in 2018. We're going to have millions of those. So the odds that we're living in the one, prior to all of this happening versus living in one of those millions is very small. Okay, something else could happen. Maybe we never get there because we've destroyed our civilization before we get to the post-human stage, or we choose not to get there. And I think we can throw that one out. That's one of Bostrom's possibilities, that we choose not to become post-human. When have we ever not followed some avenue of inquiry that's interesting to us? We took nuclear physics to its limit. We pursuing nanotech, pursuing cloning, genetic modification, all of these AI, all of these things, regardless of the dangers of the ultimate conclusion of those fields of inquiry. So as a pessimist, you could say, well, we're going to destroy ourselves and we're actually living in a real reality. As an optimist, you would have to say, no, we're not going to destroy ourselves. We will get there, create these simulations, and we're living in one. So that's Bostrom's argument. Now, the interesting thing is they did there was a colloquium on this idea of, are we living in a simulation, where I think Bostrom might have been there, David Chalmers was there, a number of very well-known scientists. I think Neil deGrasse Tyson might have even been the host of the thing. And they asked each one of these people, what do you think the odds are of us actually being in a simulation? So despite Bostrom's amazing argument, I think he still put it at, I don't know, maybe 10% or something. There was one scientist there that gave it a 47% probability or whatever. So, it's an interesting idea that, you can follow this logical argument to the conclusion that we're almost certainly in a simulation, and yet even the people who have bought into the argument just have a hard time letting go of what they think of as their physical reality.
Yeah, it's almost as if all the evidence is pointing in a particular direction, but because
right?
Yeah, it is. It's desperation. I cannot look outside of the blinkers.
Yes.
But I can perfectly, as we said earlier on, I can perfectly believe that the universe came from a point spot and expanded super fast and everything came out of that. And I can completely believe that, but I have difficulty believing what the evidence is telling me. Now, the evidence is telling us quite precisely that there's something not quite right with reality. I'm always reminded of that wonderful line by Morpheus in The Matrix, where he turns around and he says, it's like there's a kind of an itch inside your head, and you just know there's instinctively something strange. And when I'm writing and going, I always think about, for instance, when they discovered, I think it was one subatomic particle, I think it was the muon, and the research scientist involved in the research, Dr. E. Rabi, actually turned around and jokingly said, who ordered that? It was almost as if the act of thought and the act of thinking, we need to find this subatomic particle here, and it appears. But we know, don't we, between the relationship between the act of observation and the collapse of the wave function tells us that, before something is observed, it is literally, quite literally, a wave of statistical probability that then becomes a point particle in a particular location. And I know in your book you discuss about one of the evidence of this being a simulation is the idea of the mystery of the way in which subatomic particles can leap outside of a box. Statistically, one can be found outside of the box, but so many of them, they will find one. And to me, you would sometimes want to shake the scientists and say, for God's sake, move out of scientism. Just look at the facts as they're telling you,
Exactly. And really, Anthony, that's the point of the book. It's follow the information where it leads. I forget whose quote that was, but that's all I'm trying to do is say, here's a whole collection of anomalies, of, interesting data points, of research experiments. And what does that tell you? And forget about everything that you think you know at this point. Think about what that actually tells you. And you lead to this conclusion that I'm very comfortable with it. I'm not really sure why people are uncomfortable with it, but, you brought up this idea of, people getting outside of a comfort zone. I think that's key to this. When people create video games, they create video games that are just a little bit beyond people's comfort zone, or maybe within the comfort zone, but just a little bit expansive. So No Man's Sky, I don't know if you're familiar with this one.
Yeah.
So it's an infinite possibility type of of fantasy on different planets and so forth that is created dynamically. And yet each one of them is somewhat familiar. It's familiar enough not to bother you. It's familiar enough to say, yeah, I want to buy that. I want to experience that, and I want to keep on playing that and buy the next version. But if you were to put somebody in something that was completely different, it wouldn't be commercially viable. And it reminds me of some of the research on DMT. People who have done, had DMT experiences with a sufficient level of DMT, they're in a reality that's extremely uncomfortable for them because it's nothing like their current reality. And it feels like our brain is keeping us, part of our system is keeping us within this reality that is comfortable to us, and not moving out. Well, how does this relate to what we're talking about here? I think we just have to get out of our comfort zone and say, it's really okay to think that there's a simulation, because at the end of the day, what difference does it really make? It's generally a positive thing to think about reincarnation. It has positive impact on your worldview. So it's not a scary thing. And I think if people think about that and realize that they may become more comfortable with it, and it may be more acceptable as a valid field of research.
How does this fit in, though? You seem to be moving towards a very much an Eastern worldview, an Eastern philosophical worldview. So how does that fit in with, how does your hypothesis work in with the concept of Maya and various other Eastern concepts?
Yeah, it fits in perfectly. And it's kind of funny that, my girlfriend, who was born in India, and she was kind of steeped in that culture, she's read the book and she's watched me go through this research and heard some of the podcasts and so forth. And, she loves it, but she says, none of this is any surprise to my culture. None of this is any surprise to the, couple of billion people, east of Europe. It's just a surprise to the Western world. And so yeah, Anthony, there's so much similarity to, and people use different terms. The lexicon for the simulation idea is, it's not well developed. I use some terms. I use use something called all that there is, ATTI. Other people use the word God. Other people use the word global consciousness. It's just, we don't have a consistent lexicon, so it's a little bit difficult to relate these things. But if you were to turn the clock back 5,000 years and sit in rural India or China, or even 2,500 years and be in ancient Greece, people would be using different terminology and talking about the same thing. In ancient Greece, there was the idea of Zeno's paradox, which was a discrete view of the nature of time. And there was Plato's allegory of the cave, that our world is illusory. And yet in ancient India, in the Bhagavad Gita, I think it was, the most ancient text there is, and it was codified in 500 BCE, but supposedly carried down from, 5,000 years ago, was the idea of reincarnation. The idea of reincarnation is in basically every single culture throughout humanity, throughout the world, throughout history. There's the idea of reincarnation. And that commonality, I think, is significant. And the reason I think it's significant is that I believe that people discount things like spiritual experiences. When you say spiritual experience isn't like getting really connected to a movie you're watching. It's a very discrete event that happens, and it happens to, I've known people that it's happened to, I've read about this, where your reality completely changes for a little bit, and you're connected to something much, much deeper. And when you are, you come back with an awareness of the greater reality. The things that you come back with are ideas like, we are all connected. We are part of a whole. Our consciousness is immortal. We're living in an illusory reality. We reincarnate. And so all these ancient mystics, from China, from India, from the Middle East, Sikhism, Sufism, Hinduism, Christianity, early Christianity even, Native American and shamanic beliefs, they're all very, very consistent. And I think that's significant. I don't think that's something that you can just pass off as, oh yeah, it was due to communication between cultures. No, because a lot of these came from specific individuals who had the mystical experience, wrote it down, and then later on we're learning how the notes from that individual, that mystic, from that culture and that culture, how similar they all were.
Well, I think in many ways, some of the points you make there are again, music to my ears, in many ways, because I've recently come back from India. And one of the most moving things I've ever seen was in the Golden Temple at Amritsar, where the Sikhs all get together and they feed people. And of course, the basic, and you say it in your book, the basic belief system of Sikhism is that we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively, and what Guru Nanak said. But I'm also interested in your comments there about the idea that within all religions, there is this node of truth which carries through them all. And of course, Aldous Huxley would have called this, well, did call it the perennial philosophy, the idea that there is something within all religions, we are all one, and everything else. And of course, it was Huxley that took the William Blake concept of the doors of perception, which you touched upon before, the idea that under certain neurological circumstances, you can break out of the mind-forged manacles, or what Philip K. Dick called the black iron prison. You can break out of it and see the reality behind it. And we have these glimpses of these realities that suddenly, and when you come back, you can't deal with it anymore. I mean, somebody we interviewed on the show here that I've done a lot of work with is Dr. Penny Satori, who works with people who have near-death experiences, and particularly people coming back from near-death experiences and how their world has been changed, which you touched upon there. So really, if reality is as you say it is and everything, what does this mean for us? What does it mean for me? People are always looking for answers and explanations. I get this all the time where people will say, well, what does your hypothesis mean for me? But what would you say? What does it mean to our listeners to discover this? What's the ultimate purpose of it all?
Yeah, and I get that question. I think it makes sense because people are thinking about themselves, and I don't want to say that that's what this is all about, that our incarnation, our reality is about what you're getting for yourself necessarily, but it's certainly a valid question to ask, what does this mean to me? And I think it's a profound implication. So the idea that our soul is immortal, which is a conclusion that I come to based on evidence, based on thousands of cases of NDEs and OBEs and past life regressions with corroborating evidence and the quantum mechanics experiments that show an objective reality isn't there, and it all just adds up. And when you come to that conclusion, you realize that all the money spent on life extension and trying to live to 200 years or become immortal is kind of pointless, because you're already immortal. And it's more than pointless because we reincarnate for a reason. We reincarnate, and I know you have very interesting, like the Groundhog Day philosophy, that you're reincarnating to do it right again and to get it right, and then after that you can relax. And I was talking with somebody recently about that. Is that the point, or is it more a different kind of learning that you want in each incarnation? And you could make an argument for either one, but the point is that you're going to get another chance, and you're going to take your learnings from this incarnation, and you're going to be born with that set of values and that set of learnings, and you're going to go forward and make different decisions and learn more and evolve your consciousness more. So don't worry, don't fear death. And boy, that changes a lot of how people react. The other thing is, if you think that it's lights out, your worm food when you die, then your mentality is one of, I have to grab all that I can. The earth has a finite set of resources. There's a finite set of people, and I got to grab everything and make the best of it because this is the one shot that I get. Well, what does that lead to? That leads to conflict. It leads to wars. It leads to greed. It leads to all kinds of things that aren't good for humanity in general or individuals in general. But if you realize that you know, that we do have immortal consciousness, then I think, will treat people with more respect. You'll treat animals with generosity and respect. And, you know, what a different world it would be. You know, and then there's the specific thing about the power of positive thinking and the idea of intent. We, you know, we see all this evidence in terms of placebos, or, you know, people who visualize things. You know, there's little enclaves of believers of certain ideas, and they all make sense because our reality is soft. So your intent, you mentioned before how scientists, you know, are seeing certain, like the muon came, like who conjured that up? There's this idea of anomalons, which are particles that seem to exist in some research labs, but don't exist under the same scientific experiment in other research labs. Well, why is that? Could have to do with the belief system of the you know, the two different cultures that are performing these tests. So it seems like our reality is soft, and we can control it, and we can modify it, and we can stave off things that we might fear with enough advanced notice, or enough thinking, or enough meditating, and so forth. So there's a very practical application of this. Overall, all of these things together, to me, add up to a, you know, much more kind of harmonious and just and balanced worldview.
I think one of the things that I'm really fascinated by, this malleability of reality. And as a sociologist, and one of the things I studied at university was the sociology of religious beliefs and the sociology of cults and such like. And the idea that there's a kind of a collective egregore of a group of people who have a collective belief system, and that the actual collective consciousness of that group reinforces that belief system, because suddenly their world and the way they perceive the world starts to get molded around their belief systems, and everything is reinforced. And of course, now we've got the classic in terms of with the internet and with social media and everything else. There seems to be kind of people are coagulating around certain belief systems they have. But one of the areas that keeps coming up that you're the first person to make me actually sit up and really think about the Mandela effect, because I've always been very dismissive of this, and I think it's faults of memory. But in your book, you mention about Richard Kyle. I think it was Richard Kyle, wasn't it? Jaws and everything else. And I do remember the fact of that sequence where he and the girl opens her mouth and her teeth, and she's got braces on her teeth. I remember that.
Yep.
I do remember that. But now
too.
Apparently it wasn't, and it never was, or it claims it never was. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a fascinating one. And, you know, you've heard of the whole black swan idea. You know, all you need to do is find one example of a black swan to disprove the assertion that all swans are white. So yeah, there may be a lot of cases of false memory out there. I'm sure that, you know, it's been shown that you can put people in a stressful situation, and everybody will recall the specifics of that stressful situation differently. I had a communication professor one time that talked about an experiment that he did. Now, this would never be politically correct today, but he took one of his classes, and in the middle of the class, he had a guy come in with a gun, pointed at him, accusing him of having an affair with his wife, and he shot him, of course, with blanks. The professor fell down, and the class was just like ready to run out the door. And before it all, you know, came to pass, he stood up. He said, "Wait a minute, this is just a test." And then he asked everybody to describe what they saw. Some people said that the professor shot first. He never had a gun. Some people said there were 2 shots. Some people said there were no shots. There were 3 shots. Everybody had a whole different impression of what had just happened. So the idea of memory is, you know, our memories are very, very fallible. And it's kind of been shown that when we remember something, we don't remember the original incident. We remember the last time that our minds recalled that incident. So it's subject to the whisper down the lane syndrome. Given that, there are examples of what people would call the Mandela effect that are probably due to faulty memory, especially when it's a small number of people. But you get a case like the one you referred to. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. Was Richard Keel or Richard Kyle? Jaws, the henchman in the Bond movies. In that movie, there was a blonde woman that helped him get out of a pile of rubble, and he looked at her and she looked at him and she smiled at him. She had a mouthful of braces and he had this, you know, mouthful of metal, which is how he killed people. He would bite them. And because they both had metal in their mouths, they smiled, they fell in love, they walked off, and the music, you know, swooned and so forth. but when you look at the movie today, she doesn't have braces. Now, there are other cases of this, like the Berenstain Bears. There don't seem to be any artifacts that show what people seem to recall. However, in the Jaws case, there are a couple of things to point out that make it different. One is that the scene doesn't even make any sense anymore. So there's just the idea that this scene doesn't have any logic, and doesn't have any place in the movie. It was perfect for those campy era Bond movies. It was perfect for that time, and it made total sense. But now, looking at it, it doesn't make any sense. And the BBC did an obituary of Richard Kyle and referred to the scene where he met this bespectacled girl with braces. So even the BBC remembered this, and the BBC does a pretty good job of researching their sources. And so, and I've also seen some artifacts out there where there are some pictures on the web now. Of course, with Photoshop, it could be anything, but there are some pictures on the web that seem to show her with the braces. But by and large, any movie that you see now, whether it's a DVD recording or streamed or an old VHS that's been sitting there collecting dust in your shelf that you originally watched when she had braces, now she doesn't have braces, in that movie. So what could explain that? Global consciousness, faulty memory? I don't know. That seems like a stretch for me. That's not an Occam's razor type of thing for me. Some people have used the parallel universes theory to say, well, there was one, branch where she had braces and one branch where she didn't. Of course, according to this MWI interpretation of quantum mechanics, that would have to be the case. But the problem with that one is you can't jump from one branch, one universe to another. According to quantum mechanics, those things exist in Hilbert space, and you can't go from one to the other. Or let's look at the support of all the other research that's been done that show our reality is soft. And I'm going to point to Anton Zeilinger and his research at Ikoki in 2007 that said objective reality doesn't exist to a certainty of like 80 orders of magnitude, which is way beyond what's considered scientific certainty. If that's the case, if objective reality doesn't exist, then it's soft and it can be rewritten, and the artifacts can all be rewritten, including whether or not Dolly had braces. And I think that's the most likely explanation.
Wonderful. Right. Well, we're coming to the end now. So I am sure that there'll be an awful lot of our watchers, listeners, or whatever, really fascinated by your work. And you are one person in the world I would love to work with in the future, because I think if we ever work together, we could really pull up something really quite amazing. And
I would love that, Anthony.
We need to think about that in the future, maybe even lecturing together or something. Right, so if anybody's interested in your work, your website and everything else, and the book and everything, so you can tell them, where they need to contact, if they want to contact you, where your website is, and any other information you want to get across now.
Okay, sure. The website is theuniversesolved.com. That's all one word. And my email is jim@theuniversesolved.com. You also find the contact information there. I have a Facebook page as well, the Universe Solved Facebook page. So both of those are places where I post things. I do have a Twitter account, but I tend not to use that much anymore. So those are the social media outlets. On the website, there's a forum that's moderately active. It's been more active in the past, but people, discuss. One of the most interesting things there is where people have a chance to talk about anomalies that have happened in their lives. And I find that really fascinating. And it's a good kind of supplementary source of information. And I do blog. I've got maybe 100 blogs or so out there that you can find on that site as well that explore each of these ideas in a little more depth. The book's available in Kindle form and softcover form on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all your favorite online websites. Can be ordered from pretty much any bookstore as well.
Wonderful, wonderful, absolutely fantastic hour. As always, the hour just flashes by in such a short amount of time. Right, so Dia will be posting this in the next few days in terms of on Facebook and everything as well, and on YouTube. I will also be placing it on my own website as well, and we'll send a link to you so you can put it on your own website and choose to do what you want. Also, I'll just notice on Facebook, and I'll let people know that you're a Facebook friend of mine as well. So if they want to comment, or if you want to have a discussion about this particular posting, we'll try and get a lot of people involved in that way as well. Because I know you have a large amount of people interested in your work, and vice versa with myself. So there could be a bringing together of two groups as well. Okay, thanks very much for a wonderful chat. And as always, thanks to Radia Dunez over in Denver, who without her background, without her hard work and everything, this wouldn't happen. One day we'll get her on the show. One day, after a decade, I am sure that one day she will actually join us. You feel like you're dragging her in. But,
not a chance.
Hey, there you go. She spoke. That was dear, folks. That was dear. Right. Okay. Thanks very much. And we'll see you again next month. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony.